the spring of 1944, as the Second World War dragged into its third long year, a 26-year-old photographer and native-born New Yorker named Helen Levitt carried a 16mm movie camera up to the crowded tenement district of East Harlem in New York. Once predominantly Italian, but now increasingly filled with Black and Spanish-speaking newcomers. Over the next 3 years, with her friends James Agee and Janice Loeb, she struggled to capture on film the countless daily dramas and heart-stopping beauty of life in New York's poorest neighborhoods, in a film she called simply In the Street.
The streets of the poorer quarters of great cities are, above all, a theater and a battleground. There, unaware and unnoticed, every human being is a poet, a masker, a warrior, and in his innocent artistry projects against the turmoil of the street an image of existence. James Agee.
You say, what is a city? Well, a city is many things, but one of the things that a city is a home to its people. If you think of the great cities of history, Athens is glory. You say Rome is grandeur or power. Let's say Paris is culture. What is New York? New York is a home. New York's great gift to the world was that peoples from all over the world could come here. They could create their own communities, their own neighborhoods. So people felt a sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of neighborhood. That's really the basis of human endeavor. If people feel as they belong, they can go on to other things. Now, all of a sudden, that was going to be harder for New York than ever before, because at this crucial moment in the city's history, the city loses its way. Whereas before neighborhoods were created, now neighborhoods are destroyed.
Received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th.
At 7:01 p.m. on the hot, sultry evening of August 14th, 1945, after 5 tense days of conflicting rumors and false reports, word reached New York that the Japanese High Command had surrendered at last, bringing to an end the bloodiest and most costly war in human history. As the news raced through the city, millions of New Yorkers converged on Times Square, laughing, shouting, weeping, and embracing, in a spontaneous celebration that lasted all through the night and on into the early hours of the morning.
On August the 14th, when President Truman announces the surrender of Japan, I mean, the tumultuous scenes in the city. Of course, we think of celebrations all around the United States, and indeed all around the world, but no place like Times Square. That's the moment, that's the place where the real end of the war is announced and celebrated.
Twice a month now, in the delirious, jubilant days following the close of the war, the two greatest ocean liners in the world, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, which in 4 years had ferried more than 2 million men to war, could be seen steaming into port, bringing their fragile human cargo back home. As the great sister ships entered the upper bay, their decks crammed with American soldiers, a gigantic cheer went up at the sight of the ravishing skyline of New York, which had never seemed more precious or more filled with promise for the future.
Every inch of land in New Jersey and Staten Island, New York, was crowded with people cheering, and the whole thing was such an amazing vision of people brought together. which they usually are not in New York, and cheering, God bless you boys, all that stuff.
If I could pick a time to be there, I would probably be in the spring of 1946 when the troops were coming home from the war, and have seen the great ocean liners loaded to the brim with returning soldiers from Europe. We were at the pinnacle then. New York may have been not just the greatest city in the world, but that may have been the greatest time in New York.
With the great harbor filled with ships and tens of thousands of factories churning out goods in record volumes, the halcyon months following the end of the war were in many ways the highest point of the city's entire history. The terrible conflict itself had proved in many ways to be the city's salvation, lifting at last the decade-long depression and reconfirming New York's status as the unofficial capital of what was now the most powerful nation on earth.
And General, you ain't seen or heard nothing yet.
As Fiorello LaGuardia finished his third term as mayor, and as Robert Moses, unable to build during 4 long years of war, prepared to throw himself into a frenzy of construction, every force that had brought New York to greatness seemed to be operating at peak capacity.
It was the apex of the time when it was like Imperial Rome, a standard setter, a trend recognizer, a place that translated the world to America. When you look at New York in the late 40s and the early 50s, when it mattered, it just mattered in a way that other places didn't. If you come from other places, don't be upset. I mean, it just did. And it was also a place that was producing a bewildering array of stuff, and people were working. Ladies' hats and musical instruments and table lamps and printer's inks and shellac and sugar and beer and bread and skin creams. The thing about New York was that there was no one thing. You said Pittsburgh, steel, Detroit, cars, Akron, rubber. New York, everything. And that's why New York really sort of looked down on the rest of America from Olympus. And the seeds of its downfall might have been in that as well.
The core of it was that it was still a manufacturing town, which meant that people like my father with an 8th grade education, an Irish immigrant, could first of all form a family and then support it. And that sense that you would get of working men permeated the city. I remember one of the things that I missed the most was what it felt like in the subway around between the hours of 5 and 7, and being on packed subway cars with working men on those cars, guys stained with sweat, the smell of perspiration, the raw knuckled hands, toolboxes, heading home. Nobody would mess with guys like that. And they were very proud in the fact that they were working in the biggest city in the United States. They were functioning people.
And yet, more than most people realized at the time, in the giddy post-war atmosphere of triumph and success, by 1945, much of the fate of the post-war city had already been written, and the stage had been set for one of the most complex and troubling periods in the city's entire history. The war itself had vastly accelerated a fateful shift in power in America, begun during the Depression and the New Deal, that in the years to come would challenge New York's once unrivaled claim to economic supremacy and alter forever the relation of the city and the country.
It is true that there was defense spending going to New York City, but there is far more of it going to the south and far more of it going to the west. Huge quantities of money were flowing to shipbuilding operations on the West Coast. Money was going to develop in the Carolinas new, modern garment manufacturing facilities that'll turn out uniforms, not in these crowded little sweatshops, So, while New York comes out of the war in a sense, an unparalleled position of power, and it is now, in a sense, the capital of the world, These undertows have been operating, and the city's long-term position, although it's not apparent yet, is in fact going to be a lot weaker than it had been going into that war.
Certainly, no one could have imagined, in the triumphant years following the war, that in little more than 3 decades, the mighty metropolis on the banks of the Hudson would be shaken to its very foundations and fighting for its very existence. Late one night, in the waning days of December 1945, as Fiorello LaGuardia's third and final term wound quietly to a close, an aide named Louis Yavner, returning to City Hall to attend to some last-minute paperwork, was surprised to hear the sound of a lone typewriter clattering down the darkened hallway. In an office at the end of the hall, he found LaGuardia himself, hunched over his secretary's desk. "Hello, Lou," the mayor said. "I've got these letters to get out, and there was no one else around. Can you type?"
But even LaGuardia wore out. The city wore him out. You know, by the end of his third term, he was an exhausted, tired man. It had beaten him up. The process of it. Remember, this is a city who almost went bankrupt as soon as he showed up. And it's Depression, New York, that he was the mayor of. And for all of his amazing gifts, that third term was very, very hard for him.
By the time LaGuardia left office, in January 1946, to be succeeded by a tough but genial ex-policeman named William O'Dwyer, the city he loved had completely rebounded from the decade-long depression, thanks in large part to the New Deal and the war. But LaGuardia himself was already seriously ill with cancer of the pancreas, and less than 2 years later, he died, leaving his wife Marie $8,000 in war bonds and a heavily mortgaged house in the Bronx. He was 64 years old.
A city of which he was a part, as much as any public building, awoke to find the little firebrand dead. Its people had laughed with him and at him. They had been entertained by his antics, and they had been sobered by his warnings. And they found it difficult to believe that the voice he had raised on their behalf in the legislative halls of city and nation, on street corners and on the radio, was stilled forever. The New York Times.
I suppose the children have been waiting to hear their...
More than most people realized, LaGuardia's death marked the end of an era in New York.
Tracy, let's see what Dick Tracy is doing. Are you remember?
For 12 long years, he had struggled to reconcile two competing visions of the city. The shining vision of the city of tomorrow, championed by men like Robert Moses, beholden to the car and the highway, and to forces beyond the city's borders. And the old working city of Walt Whitman, Al Smith, and Emma Lazarus. The city of the block and the neighborhood and the crowded urban street. That, however shabby and run down in appearance, he had always known was New York's great strength, heartbeat, and true glory. Without him, in the years to come, those two cities would come to seem increasingly incompatible, as the forces of change unleashed by the war pulled New York into the orbit of an immense new order, increasingly indifferent to the values and beliefs LaGuardia had cared for most deeply.
After LaGuardia was mayor, he was sitting one day in the Engineers Club in New York, and a friend of his, Walter Binger, came over. He said, Major, which is what everyone called LaGuardia who really knew him, Major, you're really looking down. He said, Robert Moses has too much power today. And Binger, who really disliked Moses, said, well, who gave it to him, Major? And LaGuardia said, but I could control him. Now no one will be able to control him.
By 1945, a bold new attitude towards urban life had begun to come to the fore in New York and in cities across America. For more than 2 decades, a growing number of architects and urban planners, disturbed by the increasing congestion and chaos of the modern city, had been arguing that the old urban order of narrow streets and blocks be left behind and replaced with an entirely new one. Consecrated to the car and the highway and the dream of infinite mobility, this vision of a radiant new city of tomorrow had found its purest expression before the war in the awesome public works of Robert Moses, in the ravishing exhibits of the World's Fair, and in the writings of a visionary Swiss architect and urban theorist named Le Corbusier, who had been amongst the first to sense that cities themselves had been rendered completely obsolete by the advent of the automobile.
There's a wonderful passage from Corbusier. He walks out in the streets of Paris near the university, and he feels very nostalgic. And he says, in the good old days, when I was a student, we used to walk these streets, and we would stand in the middle of the street and argue. We could have races with each other, and we could play games, but now we're swept away by the cars. And he's very bitter about that. And then he says, what can we do? And then there's like a kind of cognitive leap, which is we have to somehow merge with the cars. We have to, if we can completely identify with them and forget this paradise lost from our youth when the streets belong to us, that, because that's the refrain, the streets belong to us then. But if you can forget that and repress the part of you that loved the streets and felt at home in them, and that feels very angry that you can't, that there's too much traffic for you now, that you don't fit in, that like history has surpassed you, you can make a leap and surpass it. And the way that he did was through this concept of the highway system and the flow that would never end and the traffic that would always be moving. And what he wanted to do in Paris and New York was to basically kill the street, tear it all down, and put up giant slabs connected by highways. I think he's probably the greatest metaphysician of the highway system anywhere. And Moses was certainly his greatest disciple.
In the years following the war, as urban planners proposed remaking the city on a breathtaking scale, New York would begin to take leave of the past as never before and rush headlong into the future. In little more than half a decade, many of the streets and neighborhoods Helen Levitt had documented so painstakingly would be razed to the ground to make way for block after block of towering high-rise housing projects. Le Corbusier himself would return to New York in the boom years following the war to begin work on an austere new complex of buildings along the East River, determined to turn Manhattan itself into a bold new city of the future.
New York is not a capital city. It is not a national capital or a state capital, but is by way of becoming the capital of the world. Along the East River, from the raised slaughterhouses of Turtle Bay, men are carving out the permanent headquarters of the United Nations, the greatest housing project of them all. In its stride, New York takes on one more interior city, to shelter this time all governments and to clear the slum called war. E.B. White.
The real shift to New York becoming the capital of the world comes after World War II, when the United States emerges from the conflict as indisputably the most powerful militarily and economic force on earth. And I think the placement of the United Nations in New York City kind of symbolizes New York's emergence as the capital of the world.
Let's put it this way, if the United Nations hadn't come to New York, I think a lot of people would have killed themselves, would just have gone berserk. It just seemed the right place for the United Nations to be. It wasn't inevitable that it would come to New York. Le Corbusier, who in many ways plays the evil spirit in this story, didn't want it to come to New York, and as the leading architect, He had a great say. He wanted it to be, if it had to be near New York, to be on some estate in Pound Ridge or Westchester. They looked at all kinds of places. My God, they even thought of Philadelphia.
Little more than a year after the end of the war, thanks in large part to the immense power of the Rockefeller family and to the administrative genius of Robert Moses, a site in New York had been settled on the east side of Manhattan, along the East River. The startling shapes that soon began to arise on a 17-acre tract of land called Blood Alley, once filled with stockyards and slaughterhouses, were unlike anything ever built in New York, or anywhere else for that matter.
The slab of glass, a totally new form, developed out of Le Corbusier's earlier work. Sheer slab, he'd never gone so extreme. Glass facing east and west, no windows facing north and south, on some kind of idea of solar orientation. Then the assembly building with its swoopy roof, a new kind of shape that has nothing to do with the city, has to be in a park because of its sculptural force. Basically, there had never been a building like that seen in New York or virtually anywhere else. All that glass, it's what everybody's been dreaming about. It's what a little bit of what you could have got a hint of if you'd gone to the fair in '39, and people are thrilled.
The arrival of the United Nations was the harbinger of a new kind of globalism in New York. By the fall of 1952, as delegates from around the world arrived for the first general session in the new headquarters, a sleek new international style had begun to transform the look and feel of central Manhattan, not only in architecture and diplomacy, but in corporate culture itself.
The UN building is decisive in reestablishing New York, and then with the completion of that building, New York enters yet another phase of its life. And it becomes more than ever office capital of the world. More new office space is built in New York roughly between 1950 and 1960 than there is in the entire of the downtown business district of Chicago. All of it, not just what was built there, but everything that ever was built there. New York becomes headquarters city. Every major corporation, even more than in the robber baron days, finds that it has to be in New York, feels that it has to be in New York. Because American corporations recognize they have to operate on an international stage, and New York is the logical place.
Even as a gleaming new city of glass and steel thrust skyward in Midtown Manhattan, another kind of transformation was underway. Far from the white-collar ramparts of Park and 6th Avenues, as hundreds of thousands of African Americans from the rural South poured into the city's poorest neighborhoods, looking for work and a new beginning.
So they came from all parts of the South. The Georgians came as soon as they were able to pick train fare off the peach trees. They came from South Carolina, where the cotton stalks were bare. The North Carolinians came with tobacco tar beneath their fingernails. Even while planning the trip, they sang spirituals such as "Jesus, Take My Hand," and chanted, "Hallelujah, I'm on my way to the promised land." Claude Brown.
By 1950, as the Great Black Migration swelled to a flood, another immense influx was underway. Within a year of the end of the war, the first regularly scheduled flights had begun taking off from San Juan Airport on the island of Puerto Rico, bound for New York City, the forerunners of thousands more, as hundreds of thousands of Spanish-speaking newcomers streamed north from the Caribbean, many fleeing desperate poverty.
This immigration is different. The Puerto Ricans come not by ship, huddled in the steerage, but by plane. Being U.S. citizens, they beat at no immigration bars. Never had their picture taken in colorful native costume behind the wire enclosures of Ellis Island. They simply seeped in, landing by the 20s and 30s from battered planes at LaGuardia Field in Newark, suddenly appearing beside their cardboard suitcases on the city's sidewalks outside a hole-in-the-wall travel agency. To them, the U.S. means New York City, and 300,000 of them now live in its 5 boroughs. Time magazine, 1949.
Yesterday, it was the brutal and uncouth Irish. Then it was the knife-wielding Italians. Later, it was the clannish Jews with their strange ways. Yesterday, it was the Negro. Today, it is the Puerto Ricans and the Negroes who are relegated to the last step of New York's social ladder. Jesus Colon.
Like their African-American counterparts, many of the Puerto Rican newcomers found it increasingly hard to rise, trapped in menial jobs and dilapidated slums by racism and discrimination, and by an ominous new trend, stealing over the city's blue-collar economy. Within a decade of the end of the Second World War, it was beginning to be clear that New York's great industrial engine, for more than a century, the first step on the ladder for newly arrived immigrants, had started to falter and slow. Far from taking on thousands of new workers each year, as in the past, factory owners now often struggled simply to keep the positions they had, in the face of stiff new competition from manufacturers in the South and West, and the city's own suburbs.
The writer Earl Shorus, in his book Latinos, says that one of the great tragedies of Puerto Ricans in the 20th century is that they came to New York, of all places. Had they come to New York earlier or gone somewhere else when they came to the United States, they probably would have done a lot better. But they came to a city that was just about to begin its transition to a post-industrial economy, and they came to be industrial workers, and that was their undoing.
In 1945, 1950, New York seemed literally to be on top of the world. The largest city in the world, the richest city in the world, the most powerful city in the world, the capital of the world. Everything seemed to be working in place. But we now see in retrospect that there were ominous signs on the horizon. The first was the loss of industry. New York City has more than 1 million industrial jobs in 1950. Those jobs over the next half century are fall to well below 200,000. So essentially, a whole gigantic sector of New York's economy leaves. In this, New York again is a leader. We've seen this happen first in cities and then in states, and now for the whole entire United States as jobs move out where there are lower production costs, first to the suburbs, then to the south, then offshore to Asia or wherever.
The loss of industry was the harbinger of an even vaster transformation. As year after year, the center of gravity of the entire nation continued to shift, away from New York and away from older urban places everywhere, as a massive new economic order finished taking hold, linked to the highway and the automobile, and incompatible with the structure of cities as they had existed for hundreds of years.
Well, I think the Second World War changes the ballgame and creates an economy on an enormous scale that really dwarfs anything that's existed before. And after the war, you get a permanent war economy. On one hand, it's an industrial bonanza, but New York was almost entirely left out of this because it's really very hard to build aircraft factories, say, in or close to New York or any other city. The sense of space is completely different. Whereas the grid involves bringing people together and creating concentration vertically going up. The war economy and the highway system built in the Eisenhower period builds across. And it depends on these enormous horizontal units. And on one hand creates bonanzas in many areas that were pretty distressed, and on the other hand draws talent, energy, and money, enormous amounts of money away from areas like New York.
In the years to come, as the entire nation was integrated into a unified flow, whose lifeblood, one man later said, was the automobile, the dense fabric of older urban places, and the very concept of urban public space itself, would begin to come under attack as never before, as cities like New York were increasingly seen as places to escape from, or as problems to be solved, or as landscapes to be transformed. To a remarkable degree, the man in the middle of the whirlwind of forces sweeping through New York in the post-war period was the driven, insatiable builder, who by 1945 had been transforming the city for almost 20 years. Robert Moses.
If you saw Moses standing in front of a map with his pencil going over it in sweeping gestures, you would see the dreamer, the visionary, the artist. He saw New York, and of course by New York, I mean New York and its suburbs, 2,100 square miles, right? An area in which, when he was building, 12 million people lived. He saw this all as a canvas. He was going to build his roads across it. He was going to build his roads around it. There were going to be parks here and parks there. And you see, then we're going to have public housing here, so we'll do this. He saw the whole thing as one great mural, you know, one huge, wonderful mural. It all had the unity of a vision. And that is the vision to which New York and its suburbs were shaped.
I am privileged to present the winner of the Grand National Award, Robert Moses of New York.
No one embodied the power and promise of post-war New York more than Robert Moses, the visionary administrator who had rebuilt the city in the depths of the Depression. Intent on uniting the immense metropolis into a single coherent whole and linking it to the rest of the nation by highways, he had accomplished more in 20 years than most men dreamed of in a lifetime. And now, with the vastly increased resources of the federal government behind him, looked forward to realizing his vision on an even vaster scale. The tragedy in the end would be that such a man and such an era should have held out such great promise, and that so much of it should have gone so terribly astray.
Immediately after the Second World War, Robert Moses's power increased exponentially to something far greater than before. Its base was still these revenues, the toll revenues from all his bridges and all his tunnels, which of course were increasing because he was building more. But he now gets control of the City Housing Authority. Huge monies are now being spent by the federal government on public housing, low-income housing. In New York, those monies were spent at the command of Robert Moses. Up to that point, Robert Moses had been building mostly parks and bridges and parkways. He was building these in a tabula rasa on the open spaces of Long Island, on Jones Beach, where there was nothing there. Now he's going to be building in the city, not on an empty canvas, but on the most crowded canvas in the world. That was going to make all the difference. It was going to make the story of Robert Moses become very dark, because whether he was building in an area with no people or an area filled with people, Robert Moses was going to build. If you want to create public works in a crowded metropolis, he said, you have to swing the meat axe. And he liked swinging the meat axe.
I enjoy getting things done.
And if that means being lonely in the
rid of
process,
obstacles that are in the way by whatever means.
and if that means being lonely along the way, that you'll put up with that temporarily, right?
Yes, and make as few compromises as possible. Now, Beardsley Rummel had a very funny phrase, a little bit on the cynical side, and a great deal of truth in it. He said, if the end doesn't justify the means, what does?
No one could have predicted the magnitude of the explosion that would overtake New York in the decades following World War II. Great as was the federal involvement in public works before the war, it was nothing compared to the massive new initiatives signed into law as soon as it was ended. Not only for highways, but for housing and urban development, propelling changes on a scale city planners had scarcely dreamed of only a few years earlier. Eager to extend his dominion over every public construction project in the city, Robert Moses quickly moved to wrest control of the new federal funds before the ink was even dry on the new legislation.
He says, I'd like to be construction coordinator. By the way, I have a bill here that the legislature will pass creating the office of construction coordinator. Nobody realizes that there is a sentence in there that says that the construction coordinator shall, no choice, shall represent the city in all its dealings with the federal government. That means that any city request for federal money is going to go through the office of construction coordinator. And he therefore has control over public housing, he has control over the federal highway money, and something much huger is about to happen. One day in the end of 1948, an old classmate of Moses's from Yale, Robert Taft, Senator Robert Taft, comes down to talk to Robert Moses about a new proposal that's going through the Senate of the United States. We are going to call it Title I. It's the Slum Clearance Program, the Urban Renewal Program. Moses had this mind that leaped at power like a terrier. As soon as Taft leaves his office, he is drafting the necessary documents so that the mayor will have a slum clearance committee, Robert Moses chairman.
There had been housing programs before and attempts to clear the slums, but never on this scale. Intended in part to relieve the severe post-war housing crisis and to provide affordable housing for the poor. The bill's first section, known forever after as Title I, would go on to become one of the most controversial and in many ways catastrophic federal programs ever visited upon city dwellers anywhere.
The bottom line for the Urban Renewal Program is that the federal government is going to pay for the city to use its power of eminent domain to confiscate land and to assemble large parcels of land from lots of little sort of slum owners in sort of blighted, rundown areas. Then they're going to tear down that land and they're going to give it to private developers to build housing on, theoretically for poor people. In the real world, that's not the way it works out. In the real world, you get a constellation of different kinds of players who've got an interest in becoming the developers who acquire Title I land. There's a huge range of possibilities. But all of these people share one thing in common. They're not interested in building housing for poor people. They're interested in building housing at the least for middle-class people. And in fact, they're also particularly not interested in housing for blacks and Hispanics, who are increasingly, in the post-war period, growing percentage of the population most in need of housing.
Hailed as a victory for the working poor, Title I quickly proved to be an enormous bonanza, not for those most in need, but for landowners and real estate developers, who under provisions of the Act were not required to build housing slum dwellers could afford, or even to build new housing at all. Despite solemn assurances to the contrary, few of those evicted under Title I found housing in the neighborhoods they had once called home. Many were not rehoused at all, and many of those that were found themselves relocated to massive new low-income housing projects, thrown up in districts segregated as never before by race and class.
The reality of it was that it was a massive program of removal of usually the people who had the least political clout, and those tended to be blacks and Hispanics and working-class Jews and working-class Italians. Now, the man at the center of this operation is Robert Moses. Moses is the coordinator of all these Title I programs, and Moses is cutting deals left and right. By 1959, there are 16 huge Title I projects that have been completed. They have moved out roughly 100,000 poor people.
Robert Moses personified an age where the interests of working class and poor people were very easily dismissed as secondary to the interests of middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy people. So if it meant tearing down hundreds of old brownstone tenements to build a new performing arts center, that was going to happen. If it meant clearing land in the hope that commercial developers would want to come in and build skyscrapers instead, then that's what you did. And often when really poor communities were fragmented in this way, where did they go? They went to the next neighborhood over. They went to the next neighborhood that might be showing some signs of weakness in the rental market, might be showing some signs of weakness in the housing market, and the problems of one neighborhood became the problems of another, far away.
One of the things that Moses does, to his shame, is he fills the slum clearance committee with a bunch of his banker and insurance and developer friends, and they begin to use the slum clearance committee's power, public power, to remove non-white people from areas where the developers want to create white neighborhoods. The result is that they uproot hundreds and thousands of black New Yorkers and force them into these expanding ghettos in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Harlem.
As striking as the racial politics of the slum clearance program was its staggering scale. Convinced that partial reconstruction of targeted neighborhoods was doomed from the start, Title I made slum clearance funds available on one condition: that nearly every structure in a designated area be destroyed. Over the next 15 years, the maelstrom of destruction that would go forward in New York, in the name of urban renewal, would dwarf anything that had come before in the city's history. As thousands of acres of teeming city blocks were reduced to giant swaths of rubble. In New York, who needs an atomic bomb? The novelist Bernard Malamud wrote. If you walked away from a place, they tore it down.
Well, sometimes I think the United States embarked on urban renewal out of some kind of elaborate guilt trip over bombing so many places in the course of the Second World War in Europe. Because we saw that by clearing these sites, suddenly the bombs made it possible for new kinds of developments and a way to modernize cities. How to tackle the problem here? We really use the same techniques. We declare whole areas after some kind of study of the declining demographics susceptible to demolition. We just simply moved people out. It became incredibly disruptive to people's lives. You scattered neighborhoods which might have been very, very poor, but still had a very dense network of associations. And you began, through urban renewal in a city like New York, but it's true in Chicago and elsewhere, that process which we are still reeling under of wrenching communities apart and then families collapsing. The whole support system of the less well-advantaged in our society collapses, and we wonder why they then become increasingly unable to function in the society as a whole.
And there were other problems as well, with what was being created, as well as what was being destroyed. Though for many New Yorkers, the new public housing projects rising from the rubble represented the first decent housing they had known. The structures themselves, shaped almost without exception to the anti-urban theories of men like Le Corbusier, had little in common with the communities they had known. Gaunt towers, isolated from the street, on enormous tracts of land called superblocks.
Planners wanted to reform the city by sweeping it clean. They hated the grid and all the way that the grid led to development of the city, and they wanted to turn the city into a green park. Federal funds would come in to buy these buildings, and you would write the land down virtually to nothing. So you return the city to degree zero. Under Moses, you could get rid of the gridiron because you'd make superblocks. Moses had no interest in commercial life on his projects. He wanted them strictly pure of commercial life, so he eliminated streets. So it makes a bigger gulf between the new development and the existing city. That's a whole betrayal, in my view, a betrayal not only of New York's traditions and history and natural structure, but also a betrayal of what makes a community.
The uptown slums are being demolished. But the rectangular tenements that replace them have not a trace of invention. Their bleakness is absolute. No man has ever dreamed of a city of such monotonous severity. And there must be some bond between our houses and our dreams. John Cheever.
Everybody, it would seem, is for the rebuilding of our cities, with a unity of approach that is remarkable. But that is not the same thing as liking cities. Most of the rebuilding underway is being designed by people who don't like cities. They do not merely dislike the noise and the dirt and the congestion. They dislike the city's variety and concentration, its tension, its hustle and bustle. The results are not cities within cities, but anti-cities. William H. White.
Title I was only part of the story. Title II was the other part of it. The federal government is not only intervening in this program that is demolishing vast areas of the inner city, it is also, in fact, underwriting the development of the suburbs by saying to banks that we are going to institute a program of mortgage guarantees. People who might look like they're dangerous credit risks and you might not want to give them a mortgage because they're not making enough money. We, the federal government, say to you that if you give these people mortgages, we will guarantee you that, in fact, if they default, we'll pay you. And because of that, money was available to flow into the private housing market, and unfortunately, it was not allowed to flow into multifamily housing in the city. What are you talking about? You're talking about, in fact, the development of the suburbs. So between this mix of programs, the federal government has opted for a policy which is profoundly anti-city.
Add to that the interstate highways, which were ready to whisk people out of the city and take them to those new homes that were rising in the cornfields and the potato fields in response to all this hot loan money being around. New York was suddenly surrounded by the changes in American life, but also got it right in the neck from various federal programs that were supposed to help the city, that said that they were about to help the American people. And boy, the destruction that came from this concentration of effects. Coincidental, it all started to happen in the late 40s, and probably any one of them New York could have fought off or somehow accommodated or made its peace with. But all of those things happening at once just was disastrous.
In the end, nothing would transform the landscape of American cities more dramatically than the billions of dollars in federal aid streaming out of Washington to build new arterial highways, culminating in the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. The most important public works project in America since the Erie Canal, the 41,000-mile system would reverse the impact of DeWitt Clinton's great achievement, drawing resources out of cities and diffusing them out across the American landscape, while committing the economy of the entire nation to a self-perpetuating culture of the automobile.
But the car has a life of its own. And you've got to have more highways so you can sell more cars. And if you make more cars, you've got to have more highways. And once you're on that treadmill, then anything that stands in the way, including that vision of the city as a civilized but dense arena, goes by the wayside. And so we've got this period when, on the one hand, we're projecting roads out into the suburbs and people are in fact motoring off on them. On the other hand, we're ramming roads through working class and poor quarters.
One way or another, Robert Moses had a hand in it all, overseeing the construction of nearly $1.5 billion in federally funded highways in little more than 15 years.
We wouldn't have any American economy without the automobile business. That's literally true. To believe that this is a great industry that has to go on and has to keep on turning out cars and trucks and buses, then there have to be places for them to run. There have to be modern roads, modern arteries. Somebody's got to build them. And in order to get those things done and done properly, people must be inconvenienced who are in the way.
After the war, everyone was beginning to realize that you had to build great arterial routes through the cities. Every city had plans for expressways, but nobody was able to build the expressways. There were two reasons. One, the staggering costs of these expressways compared to everything that had gone before in public works to build it through a crowded urban setting. The second thing is this is a democracy. You had to evict from their homes tens of thousands of people for an ordinary expressway. They were voters, and politicians shied away from the very thought of evictions on a scale like that. Moses shied away from nothing, and as soon as the war ended, he began to ram 6 great expressways right across the heart of New York.
Of all the federal projects under Robert Moses' control, none would have more devastating consequences for the city and its people, or instill more rage against its executor, than the Cross Bronx Expressway, a 225-foot wide concrete trench, 7 miles long, that would carve a path of destruction New Yorkers would never forget.
This used to be a neighborhood. The neighborhood was called East Tremont in the Bronx in New York. The heart of it was where this road runs behind me, the Cross Bronx Expressway. It was predominantly Jewish. There was also Irish and Germans in it, and some blacks. It was a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody else. It was a community. It was a place with a heart. Robert Moses tore this heart out.
The Cross Bronx Expressway goes through about 12 or 15 different neighborhoods, and it just went through the center of a great many. And the idea was that it was built on a straight line, and there was no account of who the people are and what they're doing. There was no question of, can we work this highway into existing life? This question never came up in the 1940s or 50s. They had the power to build in straight lines, and they just did.
These were still intact communities. People worked, people kept up their properties, people did business where they lived. This was a place where you did your marketing locally, you did your business locally, you got your first Holy Communion, read your Haftorah for your Bar Mitzvah. It all happened right there. It was a culturally and materially self-sufficient world in a lot of ways.
On December 4th, 1952, this community was told that Robert Moses was going to take their homes away. They all got the same letter. It was a very typical Robert Moses letter. Your homes are in the path of the already approved Cross Bronx Expressway, and you have 90 days to get out. Now, this was 1952. It was not the era of protests. And what this community tried to do was then very new. And they thought for a while that they were going to win. Their assemblyman said they would never approve it. Their state senator said it would never be approved. And Robert F. Wagner, Jr., who was running for mayor then, solemnly promised in his election campaign that he would never approve this route for the Cross Bronx Expressway. But of course, by this era, it wasn't the mayor's word that mattered, or a borough president's word that mattered, or an assemblyman's or a senator's. The only word that mattered as to where a highway was going to go in New York was Robert Moses's.
They seem to think that they have a choice, that they'd rather stay in the houses that they've lived in all this time. The whole federal arterial aid program, running into billions of dollars, depend upon the votes of a very few people in one section. We wouldn't build anything. Nothing would be built. There'd be no highways, there'd be no housing, there'd be no public improvements. The individual has to yield in matters of this kind to the entire country, to the advantages, needs of the majority of people. And there's just no other way out. No, there's no other way out.
In the end, the opposition never had a chance. On April 23rd, 1953, at a hearing of the Board of Estimate at City Hall, the Bronx Borough president underwent a mysterious change of heart after a few whispered words with Robert Moses. Not long after, the new mayor, Robert F. Wagner Jr., abruptly switched his position too. And in the summer of 1955, as stunned residents of East Tremont looked on, work began on one of the most awesome public works projects in the city's entire history.
Now, this is what it's like to build a great highway through the greatest city in the world. When the guy who built the Burma Road, General Thomas F. Farrell, came here with his chief aide, Chapin, they looked at this and they said, we thought the Burma Road was tough. It was nothing compared to this. When they came here, this valley that you see here was, of course, filled with apartment houses. So they had to demolish scores of 6- and 7-story apartment houses. But that was really nothing compared to the problems. They were going to have to blast through the ridge there. They knew that building this road was going to take 10 or 12 years. In fact, it took 12 years. They knew they couldn't interrupt the subway service. So they were going to have to keep that subway line running while they blasted through that ridge. Also inside that ridge is one of the world's largest storm sewer mains, gas mains, electric lines, telegraph cables, sewers of all types, a whole mass of utility lines. Moses was going to have to ram this road through there while keeping all those things in operation.
I remember standing on the ground parts of the concourse and watching the engineering job, which was quite magnificent and sublime because you could see the destruction in one direction. Everything was being smashed to the east, and to the west nothing had been done yet. So it looked like a completely intact city, and yet you knew it was like the artillery shells were going to come down on it, in a year, in 2 years, in a month. They didn't tell us.
And all I could think of was that this didn't have to be. Now, that very afternoon, as it happened, I had an interview with Robert Moses, and I was asking him about this expressway, and I was trying to find a polite way to address the subject, and I said, was it perhaps more difficult to build an expressway through a crowded city than to build a parkway in empty Long Island? And he said, oh, no, not at all, not really. I said, well, what about the Cross Bronx Expressway? He said, oh, no, there was no real trouble up there. I said, well, was there hardship for the people? He said, no. He said, they just stirred up the animals there. So I just held fast, and that was all we had to do. And of course, it was all he had to do, because that was the reality of political power in New York at that time.
Year after year, the rampage of destruction went on, as Robert Moses rammed one expressway after another, across communities in Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx. 13 massive roads in all, and more than 130 miles of concrete, shattering no fewer than 21 separate neighborhoods, and upending the lives of more than 250,000 people. The impact of that onslaught on the fragile ecology of New York's working-class neighborhoods would continue to reverberate for generations.
The car is not a neutral actor on the urban landscape. The car brings mobility and it brings problems. Moses only saw the mobility, he never saw the problems. If you owned a store in the area of the Cross Bronx Expressway, suddenly a third of your customers were gone. And half of those that remained were now on the other side of the highway. It knocked down all kinds of places that were the glue of neighborhood life, leaving a world in tatters, leaving pieces of neighborhoods that were no longer viable, that could no longer attract the new residents, that helped keep rents up, that helped keep property values up, that made the whole proposition of living in a place or owning property in a place a long-term proposition that you could sustain. So the Grand Concourse just hits rock bottom in these decades. Places like Mott Haven hit rock bottom to become part of the poorest congressional district in the entire country because of the many, many sorrows that the Bronx has been inflicted with.
I stood on the ramparts of the concourse and said, someday I'll get that bastard. And there were a lot of other people, too, who were standing there with me and watching the job and said, we hate that creep, someday we'll get him. He'd made a lot of enemies over the years, people who were willing to do anything to get him.
We don't pay too much attention to the critics. You never build anything. No critic ever built anything in my knowledge, and they don't bother us. New York has too many critics. We ought to get rid of some of them.
And so the frenzy of building went on, as the expressways drove through, and the tall towers rose, and whole districts were demolished to make room for high-rise housing projects, and building after building of glass and steel.
By the 60s, we knew that urban renewal was a failure. We knew that it had taken the heart and the gut out of cities. But New York's urban renewal had started in the 50s and was moving along like an unstoppable juggernaut. And there were, of course, deals made between the government and between the real estate people, the developers. It was nothing that those of us who cared about could stop. It was a done deal.
In 1956, a 30-year-old poet named Allen Ginsberg, living on East 7th Street in the Village, sought to capture the increasingly impersonal and alien landscape of the city, which he depicted as the insatiable Old Testament god Moloch, to whom children were ritually sacrificed.
What sphinx of cement and aluminum hacked open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination? Moloch, the incomprehensible prisons. Moloch, the crossbones soulless jailhouse and Congress of Sorrows. Moloch, whose buildings are judgment. Moloch, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows. Moloch, whose skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovahs. Moloch. Moloch. Robot apartments. Invisible suburbs. Skeleton treasuries. Demonic industries. Spectral nations. Invincible madhouses. They broke their backs lifting Moloch to heaven. Pavements. Trees. Radios. Tons. Wake up in Moloch. Light streaming out of the sky. Allen Ginsberg, 1956.
As the buildings rise, as the skyscrapers get bigger, as the mechanism of the city becomes more and more dehumanized, as the human being is dwarfed, as finally gigantic 1,000-windowed Molochs are created that look down on the individual and dwarf the individual and intimidate the individual. And then you find the individual at the mercy of the people up in the big towers that the person has no control over. The guy living on East 12th Street has no idea what's going on.
And still the building went on. At the southern tip of the island, hundreds of historic buildings would soon be razed to the ground to make room for two immense rectangular towers that would eventually soar higher than the Empire State Building itself. Far out across the harbor, meanwhile, Robert Moses had commenced work on yet another epic project. A mighty bridge, the longest in the world, that would eventually span the Great Narrows through which Verrazano and Henry Hudson himself had first sailed so many centuries before. By then, most of the more than 600 miles of highway Robert Moses would construct in and around New York were either complete or well underway. And Moses himself was reaching the very apogee of his power.
Well, he held 12 public jobs at once, which meant he had the overseeing power for every piece of public construction in New York. Not just the highways, the public housing projects, and the parks he built, but everything, sewers, catch basins. No one could move without Robert Moses' approval. Robert Moses, who built 627 miles of highway, never drove a car in his life except for a couple of driving lessons, unsuccessful ones that he took in 1922. His car, he had this huge limousine, of course. It was license plate 2000. And his car, when you were in it with him, you felt like you were insulated from the world. The seats were far back, you couldn't see out the windows, and they were covered in leather so fine that you really felt that you were in the library of a fine men's club when you were in his car. So he had no idea, in many ways, of what he had wrought.
But all the new building, so much of it authorized, controlled, or overseen by Moses himself, could not disguise the fact that by 1960, New York was a city that seemed to be spiraling into ever deeper trouble.
You're beginning to get people noticing that these highways and the new civic centers and projects are in fact destroying vast amounts of space that had been devoted to manufacturing. All those huge projects along the East River are replacing, in fact, acres and acres of small workshops and manufacturers. The big civic center that goes up in downtown Brooklyn, wipes out vast amounts of thriving business. We're not talking about eradicating slums anymore. I mean, they're using the word. They're saying, "Ups, you're blighted, you go." "Ups, you're a slum, you go." But in fact, these are real working class neighborhoods, and they're organized around real manufacturing centers.
Across the 5 boroughs, even neighborhoods not ravaged by highways and urban renewal had begun to stagnate and decline. By 1960, not a single mile of new subway track had been laid in more than 20 years. Banks and commercial lenders had all but written off the city's aging housing stock. And the census that year revealed an ominous new trend, as the flight to the suburbs, begun 10 years before, now began to accelerate dramatically.
The first challenge for New York is going to be the decline of the tax base in the 1950s and 1960s as white middle-class New Yorkers flee the city. After World War II, 500,000 white Brooklynites move out of that borough in 20 years. Now, the population of the borough remains the same because more than 500,000 black people move in. But ultimately, the effect of it is actually extraordinary. We've replaced middle-class communities with poorer communities, and we've isolated poor people inside inner cities with very few economic opportunities, very little chance at mobility.
And there was more trouble to come. As suburbanization and white flight continued, and the flight of industry begun 10 years before, accelerated dramatically, another exodus was underway, on the waterfront, where a revolution in shipping methods was causing the great port itself, the city's lifeblood and mainstay for more than 3.5 centuries, to spiral into decline.
Where there were 100,000 and more longshoremen in New York in 1950, as you begin to shift to containerization, you just need one guy in a cab and somebody else to hook the thing onto the container, and maybe one guy just to kind of ease it into place, and they lift these whole containers. They need lots of space for that. Well, New York City doesn't have lots of space. You need hundreds of acres to stack up the containers, to move 18-wheel tractor-trailer trucks to turn around. Well, they found that on the New Jersey side. So in these 2 huge areas, just these 2, industrial jobs, harbor jobs, New York City hemorrhages in those, let's say, 15 or 20 years really after the end of World War II.
And I think it's one of the ways of noticing how to make the city work. If the port doesn't work, the city's not going to work. And that sense of the thriving, noisy, dirty, exuberant waterfront is gone now. Take a ride down the West Side Drive now, what's left of it, you see some of the piers just rotting into the river like bad teeth. There's no people working on them. You have the one luxury liner pier, but that's not what it was up until 1962, where you would see liner after liner after liner. Maybe the great symbol of what happened to that waterfront is one of its greatest attractions right now, which is the Intrepid, which is a ship that doesn't sail. It's got a flight deck covered with ferocious-looking jet warplanes whose noses are pointed straight at H&H Bagels. It's crowded every weekend, but it doesn't go anywhere. So it employs people really as a function of memory rather than of anything that's active or new or thriving. It's a museum.
By 1962, New York seemed to many people to have lost its way. Only 30 years before, F. Scott Fitzgerald had stood atop the Empire State Building and gazed out into the endless expanse of blue and green that stretched beyond the city's borders, filled with despair to see that the city had limits. Now a new kind of despair could be discerned from the city's tallest towers. The blue and green that had once marked New York's limits had turned to gray and brown, and signified something more ominous still: the limitless suburban sprawl that was now superseding the city, an endless agglomeration of highways, parking lots, and tract housing developments, punctuated by the deteriorating cores of older urban areas that now stretched almost continuously from Boston to Washington. New York itself stood at the very center of what the French demographer Jean Gottman called megalopolis, an immense area that by 1960 was home to more than 40 million inhabitants, nearly 1 in 4 Americans. But by now, many wondered if the very notion of a center still had any real meaning, or whether cities themselves had any reason for continuing at all.
Out for a walk after a week in bed. I find them tearing up part of my block. As usual, everything in New York is torn down before you have had time to care for it. You would think the simple fact of having lasted threatened our cities like mysterious fires. James Merrill.
Until the first blows fell, no one was really convinced that Penn Station would really be demolished, or that New York would permit this monumental act of vandalism against one of the largest and finest landmarks of its age. Any city gets what it admires and will pay for, and ultimately deserves. And we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but the monuments we destroy. Ada Louise Huxtable.
One of the worst things that's happened in New York's history is the loss of Penn Station. Penn was so traumatic because this was something that belonged to everybody and that people felt was so beautiful and that they were so proud of, that they just took it for granted and felt that it couldn't possibly be torn down. Could you tear down the Grand Canyon? And then it was, and they put this really disgusting rabbit warren in its place.
How tragic, how sad that so many Americans will never know what it was like to arrive in New York for the first time in your life at Penn Station. It was spectacular. If you had never been to New York before and you came into the city for the first time and you came out and there you were in this breathtaking, man-made, wondrous architectural place. Vincent Scully says that we used to come in to New York like gods when we came into Penn Station. Now we come in to the present Penn Station like rats. It was one of the worst things to happen to an American treasure, not just in New York, but in the whole country.
Pennsylvania Station, the greatest architectural monument of the imperial age of rail, had stood for more than half a century at the corner of 7th Avenue and 33rd Street in New York. When, in the spring of 1961, the financially troubled Pennsylvania Railroad announced plans to tear the magnificent structure down and replace it with a high-rise glass and steel office tower and sports facility, hoping it would bring in more money. Though some voices were raised in protest, the coalition of architects, writers, and historians who tried to stop the demolition could do nothing to save Penn Station from the wrecker's ball. And 2 years later, on the morning of October 28, 1963, the demolition began. It would take more than 3 years in all to pull the great stone structure down. One by one, the enormous Doric columns, winged eagles, and granite angels that had ornamented its facade were cut down, carted away, and dumped in a foul-smelling swamp in the New Jersey Meadowlands.
It is inconceivable that Penn Station was destroyed, demolished for one of the sorriest replacements that one could ever imagine. Everything about the ambition of Penn Station and of the great railroad stations expresses the kind of power that had been concentrated in New York. The loss of it was a sad commentary on the ideology of modernism, the belief that new is better, the belief that modern efficiency or that the profiting from new construction is an adequate replacement for the traditions, the heritage, and the real meaning of places in people's lives.
The loss of Penn Station seemed to many an irrefutable confirmation that the age of rail had come to an end, and that the age of the automobile had triumphed. And in many ways, it had. But more than most people understood at the time, the destruction of Penn Station had marked a crucial turning point in the life of New York City.
It's when that comes down that a sense of sacrilege really activates people. It's destroying the past. It is symbolic of the triumph of the auto era over the old interconnected mass transit operations.
It generated, for many people, a different attitude about the new. You know, maybe the tradition of the new, you know, wasn't something that we should celebrate so uncritically.
I think what was gained was even more important than what was lost, and what was lost was, of course, one of the last really magnificent Beaux-Arts constructions in terms of design and space and material and architectural quality. That was lost. What was gained was an enormous groundswell, popular groundswell for preservation, that not everything was expendable, and that some things were worth a struggle, that you had to find uses, you had to find ways to keep the character and the quality and the continuity of a city. It went far beyond actually losing a station. It really was a sense of what is the city and how do you have that resonance really that you get from the past that makes the city rich and real and a rewarding place to be, that it isn't sterile, it isn't the product of building by the bottom line, which of course so much construction is.
Nobody seems to care about New York, except for those of us who live and work here. And we, who do care, believe the time has come to put a stop to the wanton destruction of our greatest buildings, to put a stop to wholesale vandalism. It may be too late to save Penn Station, but it is not too late to save New York. Jane Jacobs and the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York.
Power is a very unusual weapon, but it's a sword whose hilt, as well as its blade, is sharp as a razor, so that it cuts into not only the people on whom it is used, but it cuts into the man who's using it, changing him. And we see in the career of Robert Moses a change, a personal change, as he gets more and more power and wants more and more power. In his early days, he wanted power for the sake of the things he wanted built. More and more, you can chart it decade by decade. He chooses the things to build because of the power that they will give him.
By the early 1960s, the master plan Robert Moses had laid out for the remaking of New York, more than 3 decades before, was all but complete. Hundreds of miles of parkways and expressways, and dozens of bridges and tunnels, now connected the city to the suburban reaches of Long Island and beyond. Hundreds more had been driven through the outer boroughs themselves, weaving together, as Moses himself declared, the loose strands and frayed edges of the metropolitan arterial tapestry. But in all the frenzy of construction, the master builder had never been able to penetrate the heart of Manhattan itself with a superhighway. And in 1961, he resolved to do something about it, fixing in his sights a low-lying area of Lower Manhattan, stretching from Chinatown in the south, up through the wayward lanes and ancient side streets of Greenwich Village.
We simply repeat that cities are created by and for traffic. A city without traffic is a ghost town. The area between Canal Street and 3rd Street, a strip 3/4 of a mile wide, is the most depressed area in Lower Manhattan, and one of the worst, if not the worst, slums in the entire city. Robert Moses.
Condemning the West Village as a slum, and the old cast-iron district to the south as an obstacle to the free flow of traffic. By 1961, he had set in motion 2 immense federal initiatives. A vast urban renewal project that would level 14 entire blocks along Hudson Street in the Village. And an 8-lane elevated highway, one of his most cherished dreams, that would drive straight across the heart of Lower Manhattan, from the East River to the Hudson, destroying thousands of historic structures and displacing nearly 10,000 residents and workers.
It's difficult to even make anyone understand what would have happened. He would have bulldozed a swath about 225 feet wide right across Lower Manhattan. Today, that's the cast-iron district of Soho. What was the vision? What was the aims of a man who would decide, for the sake of the automobile, to cut a swath across a city, across a beautiful, vibrant, bustling part of the city? And you know, Robert Moses wanted to build 3 expressways across New York City, not just the Lower Manhattan. He had a Mid-Manhattan expressway, which would have run across 30th Street in the air. And he wanted to build one again at ground level at 125th Street, an Upper Manhattan expressway.
For decades, nothing had stopped the juggernaut of road building or slowed the rampage of urban renewal, which, in the name of rebuilding the city, had torn the heart out of one community after another. But this time things would turn out differently. Determined to save Manhattan from the devastation that had blighted the Bronx, residents of the Village banded together and resolved to fight, selecting as their leader a 45-year-old journalist and working mother from Hudson Street, who had that very year published a groundbreaking book about the mistakes of urban planning. Her name was Jane Jacobs, The book was called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and New York would never be the same again.
And it started out by saying something like, this is an attack on city planning. And then she went through the litany of what Le Corbusier and other ideologues had imagined what a city should be as opposed to what a city really was.
Jane Jacobs was taking on the orthodoxies of planning that had prevailed in the post-World War II period, the ideas of Le Corbusier and the Bauhaus and other planners who thought that the city needed to be renewed. There were areas that needed help, but the kind of help that she saw that they needed was the assistance to allow people to continue living in their brownstones, in the neighborhoods where they had a harmony with their neighbors. And the destruction of those neighborhoods is one of the great tragedies of post-World War II New York.
She understood that urban economies are different. She understood the sort of beehive, 1,000 different interdependent functions nature of urban economies. And that's what we lose when we surrender the street to the automobile. When people don't want to be on the street anymore, when they reshape their lives in a way that they're always in privatized space rather than sharing public space, Jane Jacobs knew 35 years ago that that was a recipe for the destruction of what makes cities wonderful.
Look what they have built. Low-income projects that become worse centers of delinquency and vandalism than the slums they were supposed to replace. Promenades that go from no place to nowhere and have no promenaders. Expressways that eviscerate great cities. This is not the rebuilding of cities. This is the sacking of cities. Jane Jacobs.
She hit the nerve at the right moment with that book. It was the right book at exactly the right moment because she made people see particulars. She made them see the street. This had been a period of urban renewal when everything was on a model, on a big plan or a drawing with overlays. And she made people look at the street and what was there. She spoke about the eyes on the street, the smaller buildings where people looked out and watched their neighbors. She spoke about the small stores, the mom and pop stores, all the things that urban renewal not only was destroying, but didn't acknowledge existed.
She basically said that from her house at 555 Hudson Street in the West Village, from the sidewalk of her block, you could observe what a whole city was like. But it returned the discussion of what urbanism should be about, what New York should be about, from big land plan games to individuals, shops, streets, cars, crosswalks, networks of people, people rich and poor living more closely together, less concerned with the elevator to the 35th floor and more concerned with the life in the 5-story walk-up.
Under the seeming disorder of the old city, wherever the old city is working successfully, is a marvelous order for maintaining the safety of the streets and the freedom of the city. It is a complex order. Its essence is the intricacy of sidewalk use, bringing with it a constant succession of eyes. This order is composed of movement and change, and we may liken it to the dance, not to a simple-minded precision dance, but to an intricate ballet in which the individual dancers and ensembles all have distinctive parts which miraculously reinforce each other and compose an orderly whole. Jane Jacobs.
Her writing enabled people to imagine her block, but also enabled people to see other blocks. She created, maybe without intending to do it, a kind of empathy, and opened up possibilities for empathy as a political force in the 60s. So that once people could imagine how other people lived, even if they didn't concretely know. They could help them, they could work for them, they could work together.
When she comes out with her book in 1961, it's not just that it's brilliantly written, it's pithy, it's punchy, it's down to earth, it's enjoyable, it's entertaining, it's mind-capturing. It's not just that, it's that what she is doing is providing a counter-narrative, a counter-argument, a counter-vision of what the city is. It's a vision that says, you don't want to break out manufacturing and send it off somewhere else. You don't want to, in fact, send the citizens off to the suburbs. What you want to have is an integrated community, the way it used to be, in essence. But you want to have people in a position to walk to work. You want small-scale buildings. You want people to be able to watch the streets. I mean, crime, to some extent, is beginning to explode in the city in the 50s, and a lot of it is, there certainly is the pathology of drugs and such, but it is also from shattered communities that have been renewed and removed and highwayed out and are in turmoil and are about, in the 60s to really explode, and not just here again, but all across the country.
Armed with a philosophy capable of countering those in power, Jacobs and her colleagues threw themselves into the fight, holding rallies, staging demonstrations, and attacking in public hearings and in print the underlying assumptions behind the culture of the automobile and of urban renewal.
And also, Jacobs is an activist. She doesn't just simply write about this stuff, but then she's out in the streets. She's demonstrating. They're trying to block the Lower Manhattan Expressway. They're trying to stop the plan to run roadways through Washington Square. They're counter-planning. They're planning a West Village building project, which is based on rehabilitation.
As he had in the Bronx, Robert Moses fought them every step of the way, marshaling every weapon at his command to blunt the opposition.
Those personally affected, adversely, or he thinks he is, he's going to be opposed to you. He doesn't want it there. He doesn't want it done at all, or he wants it done somewhere else. He wants it moved away. Now, he may be wrong. In more than half the case, or three-quarters of the case, he's wrong from his own point of view.
What do you mean by that?
I mean by that he doesn't know what's in his own interest. He isn't smart enough to visualize what you're going to do. Well, once you've built the thing, he comes around and he tells you he was always for it.
Has that happened to you?
Oh, all the time. All the time.
For decades, Robert Moses had simply ridden roughshod over all those who disagreed with him, brutally negating the power of votes, Jane Jacobs charged, with the power of money. But this time, he had completely misjudged the strength of the opposition, rising up from the streets of Greenwich Village, which had been the center of political dissent in the city since the days of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and before.
I think it maybe couldn't have happened anywhere else. The Lower East Side is different. The Village is different. It has a history. There were very experienced organizers. We were not Johnny-come-latelys. We not only knew how to organize, we not only knew how to get publicity, we not only knew how to mobilize the troops, but we knew how to form coalitions.
Mafiosi, radical Jews, factory owners, Chinese merchants, people who ordinarily never had anything to say to each other, people who ordinarily hated each other, came together to stop this. They discovered that different kinds of people could work together and really make a difference and generate a kind of power that neither of them by themselves could ever have imagined. They would call a meeting and there would be 3 times as many people as anybody expected. They'd have to find a new hall. And there was a particular thrill in this at the end of the 50s and the start of the 60s that we might be able to really make a difference. And that there was a power that was even greater than the power of cars, power of people.
At the head of the unlikely coalition was Jane Jacobs herself. Frustrated at one public hearing, she and her colleagues tore up the stenographer's report, then declared that since there was no official record of the hearing, there had been no hearing. She was arrested and charged with riot, inciting to riot, criminal mischief, and obstructing public administration. But public support for her actions only grew.
Mr. Moses says that the expressway must go through regardless of who stands in the way. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely not. If this expressway goes through, it will absolutely be catastrophic. This will set a pattern, no doubt, there that will be followed there in other parts of the city. And if he has his way, he'll crisscross the city north, south, east, and west, bisect it, trisect it, every which way with expressways. Expressways to Mr. Moses are evidently more important than people.
The evidence of the need of that thing is overwhelming from the point of view of engineering and traffic.
And that's all that matters.
Well, in the end, yes. Congestion gets bad enough, have to have it. In the meantime, what happens? DeSalvio doesn't want it, so what?
The battle over the Lower Manhattan Expressway came to a crucial climax on the night of December 11, 1962, at a tense, crowded meeting of the Board of Estimate on the second floor of City Hall. Except for one old man, Assemblyman Louis DeSalvio declared, I've been unable to find anyone of technical competence who is for this so-called expressway. And this old man is a cantankerous, stubborn old man who has done many things which may have in their time been good for New York City. But I think that the time has come for the stubborn old man to realize that too many of his dreams turn out to be nightmares for the city. And this board must realize that if it does not kill this stupid example of bad city planning, that the stench of it will haunt them and this great city for many years to come.
Jane Jacobs led the fight against that expressway. That was Moses's last. He had many last hurrahs, but that really did it. Every major politician, Lindsay, Koch, then a congressman, was in it. The debates were all over the press, nationally and internationally. And somehow the fate of what an inner city, a historic but still very modern city would be, was being decided on whether these super projects, whether clearance for housing or for an expressway, could go forward in an existing city, or whether the people who live there had rights to their own environment.
In the end, Jacobs and her allies prevailed.
Board of Estimate in an executive session today voted unanimously to turn down a proposal for a Lower Manhattan Expressway. The board is pleased.
I wonder how David felt when he bested Goliath. That's the way we felt. We felt we beat Robert Moses, you know?
Sir, you look fairly relieved, too. You lived right in the path of the proposed
right
expressway.
on Broome Street.
So this is a reprieve from a long-time sentence, isn't it?
It is, yes. It was the greatest thing the mayor ever did for the people in that neighborhood, because everybody was worried at that, and everybody was getting sick over it. So when they hear this news, this will be the best news that they ever heard for Christmas. This will act as a Christmas present for the people on Broome Street.
Would you say that the result was, in this case, a triumph of public opinion against Bob Moses?
No. There hasn't been any triumph for anybody yet.
Robert Moses always felt that he was a tremendous failure in Manhattan, that he couldn't communicate his vision to people. He built highways around the edges, but he could never get through the center. People just wouldn't buy it. They stayed attached to their streets, to their grungy houses, to their crummy neighborhoods, and kept him from doing this. They abstained from the flow. They didn't want to be part of the flow. One result of this is that Manhattan is one of the very few parts of America where you can live a whole life without a car. Okay? And where your daily life can depend on the street and on interacting with other people and on seeing what's going to happen in ways that you don't plan. And in that way, New York is different from, I think, probably every other American city. It may be the only American city without an expressway going through the center of town. And Moses felt extremely frustrated and mortified by this. but he just couldn't do it. The community protests were too great.
It was a crucial turning point in the life of New York and in the culture of cities everywhere. With their stunning victory, Jacobs and her allies had reasserted the value of the city block, and by extension, that of urban public space itself, challenging the most basic assumptions upon which New York had proceeded since the dawn of the modern age, that the new was always better than the old.
And there's a sensitivity to history, which is also a new dimension to this. I mean, you got to understand that since the 20s, it's been modern, modern, modern. And modern means dump the past, break with the past, think new, think Art Deco, think streamline, think projectile, think, tear down the old stuff, not just because, although it may be, constraint on our ability to make profits, but because it's old, because the new is intrinsically superior to the old. But Jacobs says, wait a minute, part of the texture of life in a city is that people are not just connected to each other on the street by virtue of being neighbors, but they're connected in time. There's some sense in the buildings around you that, remain, that give you a sense of being part of a continuum. The history isn't dead. It's not something which has been transcended. Today is not the first day of the rest of your life. People are beings in time, and they need to be surrounded, not entirely, but, to some extent, by the legacy, the built environment of the past.
3 years later, Jacobs' triumph would be codified in an extraordinary new law, when on April 19, 1965, Mayor Robert Wagner signed legislation establishing the Landmarks Preservation Commission. The agency came 2 years too late to save Penn Station. But in the years to come, it would save hundreds of individual buildings in New York from the Wreckers Ball, along with entire districts, including Brooklyn Heights, Greenwich Village, and Soho itself. Vibrant places Robert Moses had yearned so passionately to transform.
Well, the dark side of Moses' character was probably every bit as prominent as the bright side, especially in the context of New York City. On the one hand, we can admit that the city needed a Robert Moses to adapt and become a modern city. On the other hand, Robert Moses saw the city in some sense as a transportation problem. But New York is more than a transportation problem. And having created, let's say, the kind of minimal number of new roads and new bridges that the city needed to sort of function in the second half of the 20th century, then he began to maybe continue that beyond what was absolutely essential. And persons like Jane Jacobs and others began to say, wait a minute, why do we need this road? That the whole purpose of things is not to see how fast you can move traffic, that there's a city there, that there are people who live in neighborhoods, there are people who like it the way it is. And I think that Moses never really understood that. A man who never drove, but who created an automobile kind of circumstance, a man who was responsible for planning and building this enormous metropolis. And I think you can't escape the feeling that he really wasn't comfortable in the very city that he was responsible for building.
By 1965, the worst rampages of urban renewal were over, and the long, fateful career of Robert Moses was drawing to a close. But nothing could stop the onslaught of forces that in the decade to come would break over New York City and over older urban places everywhere, as the bill for nearly half a century of massive social change, physical upheaval, and economic transformation finished coming due.
I think that when we fetished the city form, the urban form, when traffic lanes and freeways and tall buildings and business districts become our priority, and we forget about people in neighborhoods, we actually forget about what is the lifeblood of a city. One of the things that we ended up doing by focusing on the urban form, by building taller, bigger, faster, better, is that we actually achieved physically what we wanted to. By the 1960s, New York City has actually gone through probably one of the greatest urban building booms in the history of mankind. The problem is it's in financial crisis. It's in financial crisis because we neglected neighborhoods for 40 years.
To a startling degree, the vast river of federal funds that had poured into the city for nearly 20 years had only served to accelerate anti-urban trends begun long before, hastening the flight of industry and the middle class to the suburbs and beyond, while trapping New York's most vulnerable citizens in rapidly expanding ghettos, at the heart of an inner city increasingly plagued by deteriorating finances, rising crime, falling city services, and worsening race relations. With resources dwindling and the needs of New York's poorest citizens on the rise, years of simmering racial and social tension began to erupt into open conflict on the city's streets. In the summer of 1964, riots once again ripped through Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, when an off-duty policeman shot and killed a 15-year-old boy. The violence that ensued, echoing even greater violence in cities across America, would continue for 5 full days and cast a shadow over the last of Robert Wagner's 3 terms as mayor. His successor, a liberal ex-congressman from the Upper East Side named John Lindsay, promised New Yorkers a fresh start. But from the day he took office, on January 1st, 1966, the city would be battered by one crisis after another, as the first in a series of crippling citywide strikes by municipal employees, among the lowest paid workers in the city, brought New York's transit system to a complete standstill.
In many ways, I think New York in the 60s and 70s embodied the 60s and 70s in all the ambiguities and all the tensions in American society. You have a civil rights movement that is raising all sorts of problematic questions for people about the nature of power and the nature of access to power. At the same time, you have an economic shift. You have money draining off to support the Vietnam War. We can't acknowledge that we're really fighting the war, and so we do deficit spending. It's a terrible blow, ultimately, economically. And all those things are happening not only in the country, but right in the city. And so you have a very quick shift in the vision of New York from a city with promise to a city of devastation, of poor people, of complaining people, of crumbling buildings, of inadequate services. Meanwhile, the suburbs are booming. People are moving elsewhere where labor costs might be less expensive, where opportunities are different. And what you're left with then is a city that nobody wants to support.
The 1960s and 1970s were not good for American cities. This was a time when everybody thought the suburbs were the wave of the future. It was just a matter of time until really all cities and all older neighborhoods were abandoned in favor of the car, in favor of the corporate office park, in favor of the suburban residential subdivision. It was a time of fiscal crisis as the country essentially spent its money on defense or Vietnam and as it sucked money out of cities, so that by the early 1970s, New York City was in an amazing financial crisis brought on by borrowing too much money and perhaps living beyond its means, but also it no longer had the means.
You can't even explain the layoffs in the city.
Schools were beginning to decline. The crime rate was beginning an explosive increase in New York City as in other places. The Bronx was burning. Every night there were fires that you could see, and so there was an orange glow. We heard about Fort Apache, these dangerous police precincts.
By 1970, the city that had emerged from the Second World War as the most powerful metropolis on Earth had begun to spiral downward into an abyss of urban chaos and despair almost without precedent in American urban history.
Well, the worst feature of New York in that period for me are the neighborhoods that were falling apart. A lot of the South Bronx in the course of the 70s was burnt down. Okay, the biggest industry in the Bronx became arson. The 1976 World Series Whether it was a night game at Yankee Stadium, the Goodyear blimp showed about a mile away a building was burning down, and Howard Cosell said, "What's wrong with these people that they burn down their houses?" Some people began to suggest that it had to do with the character of the landlords and the fact that you could collect more money on insurance than you could collect in grant on buildings that were old and needed constant refinancing, and ironically that were redlined, because the whole Bronx was redlined in this period. So you couldn't fix up the building, but you could fix it down.
By 1973, more than 2,000 city blocks had been burned to the ground. More than 43,000 apartments had been destroyed, and the South Bronx had become a symbol around the world of urban decline.
There was this brief period in the 1970s especially where it seemed like New York was really going to be further and further off the chart. It really did feel like neighborhoods were being sequentially abandoned by their owners. You could see it on the Lower East Side. Landlord arson was rampant because that was the only way they'd ever be able to make money. They couldn't get people to move into these places, so they might as well burn them down. And it really seemed like this was just going to happen all throughout the island.
For the city itself, there was one final chapter to come, in the long downward spiral begun 3 decades before. All through John Lindsay's second term, as tax revenues faltered and expenses soared, the beleaguered mayor had refused to cut the crucial public programs that had been New York's hallmark since the days of the Depression. Using hundreds of millions of dollars earmarked for long-term capital projects to cover the mounting shortfall, borrowing hundreds of millions more to make up for that, and rolling over the ever-mounting debt from one year to another.
Very bad accounting practices. The city was in effect borrowing to buy groceries. People and political institutions should borrow money for capital reasons. The city was borrowing money in order to meet its current bills. And you can't do that forever.
I think this culminated in the fiscal crisis in the early 1970s because it kind of brought it all together. Sure, it was partly because the city was living beyond its means and trying to maintain this kind of old New Deal attitude of building public hospitals and public colleges and generous public welfare benefits, even when the rest of the nation wasn't following behind.
By 1975, more than $2 billion a year were going simply to service New York's enormous $11 billion debt, which was increasing now at an alarming rate with each passing month, and threatening to capsize the new administration of John Lindsay's successor, Mayor Abe Beame.
They're going to want to know if New York City is going down the drain. Now, is it safe to say that New York City
is not going down the drain?
That October, the apocalyptic reckoning city leaders had been attempting to stave off for nearly 10 years finally came due, when the consortium of banks that had freely lent the city billions of dollars over the previous decade abruptly suspended New York's borrowing privileges until the city had put its financial house in order. Within days, the city was facing a fiscal crisis unlike any since the darkest hours of the Depression.
The bank said, looking at how much money New York City owed, we're not going to lend you any more money. And nobody believed they would ever do that. And they just shut the window.
The banks essentially said to New York, give us $6 billion back now, please. And New York City couldn't do that. So in a sense, New York City was bankrupt or virtually bankrupt. And the fiscal crisis is the process of getting $6 billion to pay back the banks the money that they once loaned to the city.
With the prospect of bankruptcy staring them in the face, city leaders turned in desperation to the one source that could possibly save them, the federal government, submitting a request for more than $2 billion in emergency loan guarantees, the city's last hope of avoiding complete financial ruin. President Gerald Ford's stunning response came in a speech on October 29th at the National Press Club in Washington.
Responsibility for New York City's financial problems is being left on the front doorstep of the federal government, unwanted and abandoned by its real parents. And when New York City now asks,
the rest of the country to guarantee its bills, it can be no surprise that many other Americans ask why.
Municipal default, Ford concluded, would be a good thing for New York, forcing the city to curtail its traditionally spendthrift ways. No federal loan guarantees would be forthcoming. The next day, a towering black headline loomed ominously from the front page of the Daily News. Ford to city, drop dead.
But what's astonishing is that the President of the United States could essentially tell the greatest city in the Western world to drop dead. Of course, he didn't say it exactly, but remember those Daily News headlines, drop dead, New York City. Tells you just how far, in a sense, the city had sunk there.
A city that had sent so many successful people out into the world should have had more friends by the mid-70s. It was surrounded by people who did not wish the place well, and interestingly, people whose own life stories pass through the five boroughs are decamped in Jersey and Westchester and out on the island. And when that Daily News headline comes out, Ford to city, drop dead, instead of recoiling in horror, they're saying, yeah, drop dead. We think you should drop dead too. It was a terrible, terrible time. It really was. Instead of looking at this as a treasure of the American scene, New York was seen as representing almost everything that was worst about post-war America.
In its blunt and homely way, the headline in the Daily News captured as nothing else had the basic assumption behind President Ford's remarks, an assumption that had been growing more and more commonplace among Americans for years, as the city's social and economic problems multiplied. New York, like many of the nation's older cities, was plummeting into the abyss. New York, America's extraordinary, unwieldy experiment in capitalism and democracy, hope and greed, had failed. New York, city of cities, capital of capitalism, gateway to America, was going to die. And good riddance.
Grace Paley, one of the great New York writers, has a story written early 70s, South Bronx, and one of the characters, who's like a community organizer there, says the buildings are burning down on one side of the street and the kids are trying to put something together on the other. And this could be a parable of one of the great achievements of that period from a lot of the neighborhoods that were most devastated in New York. The earliest form in which most people who weren't part of that neighborhood saw it was the graffiti that appeared on the subways in the 70s. And this was on a very rickety, decaying generation of gray trains. They painted enormously exuberant colored names and reliefs and mottos. And you can see many films now. A gray day, a gray neighborhood, an L train, and suddenly the L train is like a rainbow, and it's thrilling. The next incarnation was rap. The earliest form that people saw would be there would be one kid rapping with small speakers and a drum track in the subway, with a hat open for money. And, these are parables of a city that's being ruined, that's being destroyed, and that's saying, we can rise again. We come from ruins, but we're not ruined. And, in 15 years, it's become the basic form of world music. So it's a thrill, but it's important to understand that it came from totally burnt out, ruined districts, and that's where it was born. And it was born out of this suffering and misery. And that a lot of the creativity that New York has always had has come from the cellars, from the ruins, from how the other half lives. So an important part of sharing space and living city life is being able to live through the ways in which the city itself is torn down and is consumed and is destroyed, but also consumes itself. You know, if you can do that, you can become more human and more alive than you've been before.
In the end, of course, the city didn't die. Despite all the destruction and heartbreak of the post-war years, despite the demise of neighborhoods and the loss of industry and the bitter clash of races and classes, despite everything, as it had so many times in the past, the city, to almost everyone's surprise, got back up off the floor and began to revive. Less than a month after refusing to come to the city's aid, President Ford reversed himself and grudgingly agreed to approve the city's request for loan guarantees. Warned by advisors that New York's demise might trigger a catastrophic domino effect of fiscal default that would bring down one city after another across the country. With time to put its finances in order, city officials moved with startling dispatch, cutting services, repaying the city's outstanding loans, and balancing the city budget by 1981, a full year ahead of schedule. In the end, the U.S. Treasury made millions of dollars out of its arrangement with New York.
I think New York became the experiment ground for a new national program of austerity, to check the power of labor and to reverse some of the trends of New Deal liberalism. It was put on display, and it was created as a kind of negative object example. This is liberalism gone amok. This is a kind of degeneration, a kind of moral degeneracy that can only be solved by the old-fashioned medicine of fiscal austerity. And it's a program that, in a sense, was then successful in New York and followed in the 1980s in the country at large.
The summer of my election, I went for a walk on the Brighton Beach boardwalk. It was August. Suddenly, I heard a woman calling, "Mayor, Mayor." And I looked down the boardwalk, and there was this elderly lady. She must have been in her late 70s. And she came towards me. She took my hand, and she looked at me, and she said, "Mayor, make it like it was." And I must tell you, I still have goose pimples. And I thought to myself as she said it, "Madam, it never was the way you think it was, but I'll try."
In the years to come, despite the terrible hardships that continued to be suffered by many of New York's most vulnerable citizens, the city would not only survive, but begin to thrive and flourish again. In large measure because the urban qualities that had defined the city since the time of the Dutch began to reassert themselves, not as problems to be solved, but as crucial urban values to be celebrated, nurtured, and sustained.
What I think accounts for New York's success in reinventing itself at the end of the 20th century are the very strengths that the Dutch, the first little settlement in the 17th century, made visible. The heterogeneity of the city, so that everyone was welcome. Maybe everyone would not be loved. We're not going to be pleasant. We're not going to hug you. We're not going to even say good morning every time we see you. But in the end, opportunity is here. People knew it. So we have this incredible immigration flows which accelerate after the mid-1960s with the new immigration laws. Secondly, we have the same kind of entrepreneurial spirit that the Dutch West India Company had established in 1624 that has kind of run through New York all the time. Third, I think it's the density and concentration of New York. There's something about the mood of the place that's directed toward achievement and getting something done. Fourthly, I think it's always been a kind of an openness to change. New York City was always willing to go with what worked, to find the balance, to reach a new understanding.
By the 1980s, as the city's role within the widening gyre of an increasingly global economy continued to shift and change. The relentless commercial energy that had characterized New York for nearly 400 years began to return, with a frantic intensity not seen on Wall Street since the days of the Roaring '20s. By the 1990s, though the days of New York's blue-collar glory were over, most of the hundreds of thousands of jobs that had been lost had been replaced, as thousands of new companies and small businesses streamed back into New York, eager to draw on the unique concentration of talent and resources gathered there, and attracted by the very density that had once driven businesses away.
Cities bring a lot of people together. Some people feel too many people, too big crowds, but there's a great commandment of urban life that can be a tremendous source of happiness. Thou shalt share space. I mean, cities in many ways are expensive and inconvenient and noisy and dirty, but the wonderful thing about them is the way they bring people together. You design cities that don't let people get together, you're losing what may be most special and beautiful about them. And then, of course, make people think, why bother to live in a city at all if you don't even have what's most special about the city?
By the turn of the century, the greatest and most moving sign of the city's miraculous revival could be seen on the city streets themselves, which, within 10 years of the end of the fiscal crisis, were filled with hundreds of thousands of newcomers from around the world, who had been pouring into New York since the mid-1960s, when the federal government finally reopened the Great Human Gateway Emma Lazarus had called the Golden Door.
I mean, New York became the kind of port that it had been at the beginning of the 20th century again. And people began coming in enormous numbers from East Asia, from Latin America, from Eastern Europe, colonizing neighborhoods that many people considered abandoned. The Census Department says that now something like 43% of New Yorkers, have been born outside the USA. And they said that they haven't been comparable figures since 1910.
By the end of the 20th century, the fiscal crisis had dwindled to a memory, and New York seemed to have reinvented itself once again. The epic transformations of the previous half-century had left the city with a host of intractable problems, including failing schools, a crumbling infrastructure, and immense disparities of income, race, and opportunity. But the city had come back, and Americans everywhere had begun to recognize the crucial role urban places had played in the tapestry of American history, carrying on the experiment New York had begun on the banks of the Hudson 400 years before.
The experiment is, how close can rich and poor live before the fabric completely falls apart? How close can you put ethnic groups that don't like one another much? How much can you promise people about a rich and privileged future and then not really be able to deliver before they rise up and say enough? And the answer here over and over and over again has been that the fabric becomes tattered, that sometimes the fabric even becomes torn, but the fabric survives.